Today, we are going to wrap up our series on the book of James. The last couple of weeks during these devotionals, we have been going through the book of James. We've looked at a couple different principles that James talks about. The first week, we talked about listening, how we can be better listeners. And then last week, we talked about law giving. We talked about how what James says in chapter 2 and a little bit in chapter 4 as well, about how we are people who have been given much grace. And this week, I want to look at kind of the bookends of James in chapters 1 and 5. And then next week, we will begin on a new series during these devotionals. But as we look at the bookends of James chapters 1 and 5, we see that they deal a lot with patience and prayer. And that's what I want to look at today, is really more the patience part of that. There's a lot that James talks about, a lot that he covers in those two chapters. And I was hoping to get through more today than I think I'll be able to. So what I would encourage you to do is to stop right now, to pause it, and to go read chapters 1 and 5, because we're just going to look at a very small section in chapter 5 and not be able to cover the whole thing. But there's a lot of good stuff there. And so I'm going to give you just a second to pause it and go look at chapters 1 and 5. Go read through them. Alrighty, hopefully you paused it and read through those. A lot of good stuff in these two chapters. Chapter 1 begins with patience. Count it a blessing, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because it produces perseverance, which ultimately leads to maturity, it leads to growth. And then we come back to chapter 5, and I want to look at what James says here about patience in chapter 5, verses 7 through 12. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. Right now, I think many of us are in a season like this. And I think that maybe that's not the terminology that we would always use. We may not all say, well, I'm in a season like this right now, but I think that what we are going through, what most of us are enduring right now, is a season of waiting. I know that the last few weeks, last few months, the last year have been a difficult one on many of us. And we talk about the trials that we've come through. We talk about all the difficulties that we've gone through. But I think that really what we need to remember is that we're in a season of waiting. We are in a period where we are waiting. We're waiting for a lot of different things right now. Maybe we're waiting on God to answer a prayer that we've been praying for a long time. Maybe we're waiting for God to bring us through the most recent struggle or heartache that we've been dealing with. Maybe we're waiting for God to rescue us from our financial situation. Maybe we're waiting for God to do something with our lives because we feel so useless right now. Maybe we're waiting for community to come back and be a part of our everyday lives. Maybe we're waiting to just see smiling faces. Maybe we're waiting to be able to worship the way that we once were able to. Whatever it is, I think that most of us can agree that we're in, to some extent, a season, a period of waiting. We're having to endure something. We're having to suffer through it. We're having to struggle with things that maybe we didn't anticipate struggling with. But whatever the case may be, being in a season of waiting, I think, is something that there are many mixed ideas about, in many different ways in which different personalities handle that. And what I want us to focus on today is that in this period, in this season of waiting, waiting does not mean to sit around and twiddle our thumbs. That's not what God is putting us through right now. God is not allowing us to wait so that we can twiddle our thumbs and see what He's going to do. God is eventually going to do something. God is currently doing things in our lives and the lives of those around us. But until we see the big, this is what God is doing in my life, we're not called to sit down and wait. But instead, during this period of waiting, we're called to work. We're called to be productive. We are called to do something. And maybe what we're being called to do is being called to suffer. Maybe that's exactly where God wants us right now. It's in a place where we are learning to be patient, a place where we are learning to endure. James gives two examples here, or a couple of different examples in these verses. And the first one, the one that I really want to look at, talks more so about the patience side of this than the long suffering. I think that it's one that is very helpful to me during this time and is probably going to be helpful to you as well. The first example that James uses is that of a farmer. I think that we can learn quite a bit from farmers. Farmers are some incredibly patient people. As a farmer, you can't wake up one day and decide that I'm going to have crops tonight. As a farmer, you can wake up and decide I'm eventually going to have crops. But it's not something that you can make happen immediately. It's not something that is instantaneous. It's something that takes patience. It takes work. But farmers don't go out and sow the field and plant and harvest. And during that time, they don't just plant and then sit and twiddle thumbs and wait to see what happens. They don't just wait around to see if Mother Nature is going to bless their crops or if it's going to curse their crops. But instead, farmers get up and they get to work. They start doing, they get after, they go out, and every single day they are doing something. Every single day they are preparing because they know that ultimately the crops are going to produce something. Eventually, what they have planted, what has been planted in their field, is going to produce something. And they get to decide whether it's something that's worth producing or not. And they decide that by what they do during the time of waiting. And every good farmer knows that they have to get up and immediately, as soon as you have planted that seed, that's when the work begins. It's long before that, but that's when you have to start taking off and getting things done because you only have so much time before the crops will produce and you'll be able to tell whether it was something good or not. Farmers know that the only thing that can be produced in a day, the only produce that they can wake up and say, I want something tomorrow, is weeds. The only thing they can wake up and say, I really want this tomorrow and have it, is weeds, something that's not worth having at all. Because something worth having takes work and it takes waiting. The things that are truly meaningful in our lives are going to take effort and they're going to take endurance. The second example that James gives to us is with the nation of Israel. He looks back to the prophets. And I think if we've read through our Old Testament at all, then we've seen how many of the prophets had to endure long suffering. We think of Job, who had to endure a time of incredible hardship, where he lost his family, his livestock, his home, his wealth, his friends, everything and everyone that was near and dear to Job, he lost. And that was, I think, more of an example of long suffering for us. Yes, there was definitely that is patience, but this gives us more the idea of long suffering. Job was in intense suffering. His life had been wrecked and devastated, and he was having to endure it and wait to see what God would do with it. But in that time, he still tries to defend himself that it wasn't of him that this happened, but he also, we see, continues to not shift the blame to God, but instead understand that God will do something through this. God is working in this moment, even if it doesn't feel like it, even if life is miserable, God is going to do something great. As we look at these two examples here, as we look at everything that James has to say on patience, there's a lot that can give us comfort, a lot that we can find hope in. But the big thing that I want us to get is this. Right now, for many of us, God is allowing us to wait. But that isn't an excuse to do nothing. How are we growing during this period of waiting? Waiting plus nothing equals weeds. Waiting plus work equals a harvest. If we want to produce something good, if we want to produce love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, if we want to produce the Christian virtues, if we want to produce good fruit, if we want to produce glory that can be shown to God during this difficult time, we're going to have to be patient in our waiting, but we're also going to have to put our heads down and work. And that is how we overcome this period of waiting, this period of long suffering. So how will you grow during your season of waiting?